Now that the One D&D playtest has been going on for a bit over 6 months, I thought that it would be a good time to take stock of some of the changes, the design direction, and maybe make a few predictions for the future. Game design is an incredibly complex web of give and take and nuance, which makes it famously difficult for discussing on the internet. Nevertheless, that's what I'm going to try to do. I want to start off by explaining what exactly I'm referring to when I talk about design, and specifically as it relates to One D&D. If you've seen some of my recent videos, you've likely heard me mention this repeatedly, but I'm always shocked by how consistently what I'm saying is misinterpreted. Perhaps that's on me due to a lack of clarity, and that's something that I will own and continue to try to work on, but I do also think that a good portion of it stems from people who are just unwilling to put aside their own preferences for the sake of an open-minded discussion. During these discussions, including many of my previous One D&D videos, my goal is to engage in a conversation that is objective and design first, at least as much as possible. What this means is that I do my absolute best to remove myself and my own inherent biases for what I want from the game in an effort to put myself in the shoes of the designers at Wizards of the Coast who are trying to craft a game that will be enjoyed by millions of players around the world, each of which will have their own draw and reason that they came to the table to play. This process is much bigger than myself, and it's bigger than anyone watching this video, and sometimes it can be extremely difficult to get out of our own bubbles, but I do sincerely hope to push myself and anyone else to try to do the same. If we take my previous video about the One D&D Paladin as an example, this statement might seem at odds with it, but let me explain. Firstly, me trying to take an objective, design-first approach does not preclude me from voicing my own opinions or thoughts, and, though nuanced, there is a world of difference between providing my own opinions on an already made design change and me sharing my opinions on something that I think should be done. The latter of which I generally try and shy away from. In the Paladin video, I mentioned how the changes made to Divine Smite are good for the overall health of the game, a statement that I still stand by. However, never once did I say that it was the only approach to reach the same end result. As I mentioned in the Paladin video, I actually love the 5e version of Divine Smite. I think it's incredibly fun and does provide some degree of choice for the player. However, that also doesn't stop me from recognizing that it is a feature that is potentially problematic and that addressing it was likely the right call. The other half of the design-first discussion is essentially to say that power sort of falls by the wayside. Now, that does not mean that power isn't important. On the contrary, power can absolutely make or break a game and can easily destroy wonderful designs by making them feel way too good or not nearly good enough. What I'm trying to say is that design should inform power, not the other way around. The design team should not be worried about the exact damage output of a certain feature or spell when brainstorming ideas. The focus should be on how that feature or spell feels to use, the impact that it has at the table, and any synergies that it might create. In large part, these are the determining factors for how fun something is. Again, this is not me saying that power or damage isn't fun, but rather, once the design is right, the numbers can easily be tweaked and adjusted to keep them in line with the theme and the positioning of the ability to amplify the fun by having created an ability that feels amazing to use, creates memorable and impactful moments at the table, and hits just the way that you'd expect it to. Something else that I've seen come up in a few comments on my videos is the notion that I believe that all classes and features should be perfectly balanced, that there should be equal class representation and every option should be equally as good as any other option. I want to be unequivocal here. I do not think that this should be the goal. Perfect balance and equalized options sounds like a great idea until you consider that this essentially removes meaningful decisions, which is fundamentally what this game is entirely about. Certain classes should be better at certain things than others. Certain features should be better than others depending on the situation at hand. Certain spells should be better than others in varieties of situations. The great unifier of this game is meaningful choice, and that is what should be strived for at least as much as possible and where applicable, provided that it isn't also creating decision fatigue. Some things can and probably should just remain at surface level, and that is fine. It's even perfectly fine for two similar options to have one clear choice in a particular situation. However, what is not okay from a game design perspective are extreme outliers. Extreme outliers remove meaningful choice. If 95% of the time or more you are picking the same option, that means that there wasn't a real choice to begin with. One example of this that exists right now in 5th edition is Warlock's Eldritch Blast. As it is a cantrip, you don't have to choose it, nothing is forcing you to, but not choosing it dramatically limits the capability of the class that was clearly designed around the player choosing it. I'm not saying that it's impossible to play a Warlock without Eldritch Blast, but doing so creates such a hindrance to your character that it virtually makes no sense. Honestly, I could talk for hours about design philosophy and the considerations that it brings to this playtest, but in an effort to make this video have a point, I do want to move on. Suffice it to say that power should not be the focus of feedback during the playtest. Meaningful choice is critical to engaging players, fun is king, and just because you or I don't like something in particular, it doesn't mean that it isn't beneficial for the overall good of the game. So with all that in mind, I want to talk about the recent updates we received from Jeremy Crawford regarding the feedback from the Expert Classes UA, which released back in September. This 36-minute video provided us with so much insight into the team's design process, how they think, how they evaluate our feedback, and how they iterate based on it. I think it's really important that we do discuss that last point that I just mentioned, how the team iterates on feedback. So much of the discussion that arises with each subsequent UA makes reference to previous UAs in the playtest as though they were set in stone. We saw X happen to the Ranger, so therefore Y can't happen. They did something to this feat, so now they can't make this other feat. It often feels like this community is forgetting that this playtest process is designed to be iterative. The team has been very clear from the beginning that the versions we are seeing in each UA will not be the final versions that we see in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Jeremy Crawford made this very clear once again in his latest discussion, where he talks at length about the reasons for the team choosing the wild shape design that they went with, and how they fully recognize that not only is the community extremely diverse, but that their tastes change over time. Referencing what I mentioned earlier, this is a nod to the fact that the team is not designing with one table or even their tables in mind. They are trying to, as Jeremy said, thread the needle to create the Druid that Druid players really want. They very clearly recognize that it is impossible to make everyone completely and 100% satisfied with every change that they make. This is why they consider satisfaction scores above 80% to be excellent, and even above 70% as very good. They know that when they present certain changes, that there will be pushback, but their ultimate goal is to find those commonalities among the people that love what they see and those that are dissatisfied. He even clarified that we will be seeing at least one, probably even two more iterations of Druid before this process is over. It's also worth pointing out here that this design philosophy is not unique to the Druid rework, but rather serves as a guiding principle for this entire process. Pushing the envelope, building consensus, and trying new things is the best way to create a design that is fun and engaging for as many people as possible. Something that I think about a lot in regard to One D&D and game design is complexity. I see comments all over on my videos and on others and on Reddit all about how One D&D is removing all of the complexity and, as a result, is ruining the game. This probably won't shock a lot of people, but I fully disagree with this notion. To be clear, I'm not saying that they aren't removing complexity, but what I am saying is that I don't think that removing it is ruining the game. Hear me out. There is so much regard for having a lot of complexity in the game as if this is the last bastion of hope for the quote-unquote real gamers, but the reality is that complexity on its own can be much more of a detriment to the play experience than anything else, and I don't mean just because it's making things hard. Complexity for complexity's sake is just objectively bad design. Say, for example, when attempting to hit a creature, you had to roll an amount of d20s equal to your character level plus your proficiency bonus, divide that by 2, round up, average the totals, and then add your strength or dexterity scores. That's a complicated process, and more importantly, it's not interesting and adds no value or depth. Obviously, this is an extreme example that doesn't even exist in the game, but it very clearly illustrates why on its own, complexity is not the holy grail for game design. Though often conflated, complexity and depth are distinctly different. Game systems or mechanics should be designed to create depth and engagement, and not strictly to be complicated. If they are complicated, that's fine, provided that the complication is justified by the added value. Jeremy Crawford touched on this during the video as well, in the portion where he discusses the feedback on the Rogue Sneak Attack feature. Generally speaking, there was a lot of dissatisfaction among the community for the fact that Sneak Attack, as presented in the Expert Classes UA, no longer works outside of the Rogue's turn. He explains that this was a decision they made in an effort to speed up play and reduce complexity. He mentions how they constantly receive feedback about the community's desire to have the pace of combat be increased, and they saw this as one small potential opportunity to do just that. However, they always have to weigh that desire against the loss of versatility, complexity, or fun that Sneak Attack in this case brings to the game, and ultimately decided that it wasn't worth the trade-off and are likely going to be reversing course on that decision. Jeremy doubles down on this thought again when he talks about the intentional removal of the stable quasi-condition from the game. He notes that they often look for rules that, if you have to remember, there is some kind of upside to remembering it. All of this, once again, ties back to the point from earlier that nothing in these documents is set in stone. It is entirely subject to change. In relation to the Druid and Wild Shape, I truly don't believe that the complexity of having to dig through hundreds of monster stat blocks when there are a plethora of other ways of achieving the same amount of depth is justified. We should not be beholden to the way that something works simply because we're used to it. I made an entire video dedicated to the discussion of Wild Shape, so check it out if you haven't already. All of these criticisms of One D&D's alleged lack of complexity tend to stem from comments saying how the game has been dumbed down or is now too easy, as if to suggest that somehow the game being accessible is inherently a bad thing. While I can certainly agree that a game that brings no depth can get boring after a while, I think it's important to remember that complexity isn't always necessarily good either. I want to quickly touch on the progress and shifts in design philosophy that we've seen over time, not by focusing on any one particular feature, but rather on general changes made across the playtest documents. Perhaps one of the most notable changes has been the move away from the proficiency bonus per long rest. This is a mechanic used significantly in the early UAs and has seen substantially less usage in recent ones. There can be a number of reasons for this. Perhaps this mechanic is something that is being mostly reserved for the expert group, or what I feel is more likely is that the team is already iterating based on the feedback from the community that while this mechanic can certainly have its place, it feels like it could be a bit overdone. There's been a distinct shift to increasing the relevance and potency of the short rest and properly utilizing the adventuring day, something that I've seen a lot of discussions advocating for. Another feature we are seeing change in real time already is a walk back from proficiency bonus scaling in general. There is a specific design note about this in the Druid and Paladin UA, where the team mentions that scaling powerful class features off of proficiency bonus is far too generous to multi-class characters and that they are going to be taking a step back from this. I think it is very likely that we will see a continued trend in reducing the emphasis on this type of scaling in both the unseen classes and even in the revisions to the previous UAs. The last major change that I want to touch on is that I believe that we will be seeing a greatly expanded use of the templated approach that we saw with Wild Shape, or at the very least a provided set of usable stat blocks for spells like the infamous Conjure Animals. This again is an example of a spell that adds a lot of complexity for not a lot of depth or value. Managing up to 8 additional creatures on the table that typically have access to features like pack tactics turns the game into a little bit of madness. It is a super fun spell to use, I love the flavor and the concept, but I can certainly see it and others like it getting a big rework. Ultimately, the point that I'm trying to make is just the importance of keeping an open mind. We all love this game, it's why you stumbled upon this video and made it this far into it. When considering changes, we need to focus on the design and the concepts and what is fun, and not whether it's too weak or too strong. Those things will come with time and iteration because, as I've said before, when couched in the right design, power is so incredibly easy to tweak. I want to be clear about a few final things here though. Dungeons & Dragons is a game and it's supposed to be fun. I don't think that this game or this process should be some sterile white room theoretical experiment. We are all using our own perspectives to help influence this game that we all love, and that is also why I am in no way trying to convince anyone of anything or change anyone's opinion. I don't believe that my thoughts and ideas for what would make the game great are what is also objectively good for the game. I am merely doing my best to encourage and facilitate an open-minded discussion and comment on the merit of already made design decisions, their impacts on the health of the game, and to hear thoughts from other perspectives that I may not have considered before, so that when I fill in feedback surveys, I am as informed as possible. This whole process is about trying to make the game the best that it can for as many people as possible, because that is where the fun really happens. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and taking a look at some of my other One D&D content. It's all linked on screen right now, but otherwise, take care.